Hello and welcome to another podcast of Father and Joe. I'm Joe Rocky here with Father Boniface Hicks. And Father, in my world, masses have started to turn on. We've had an opportunity to go to 2 weeks now of Sunday masses under Governor Wolf's rules, basically. Obviously, they're the guidelines that the churches have to follow so that they can stay open and not get re-shut down again. And whether or not the rules are smart or adequate, it's kind of irrelevant to today's conversation. What I wanted to discuss was the way that, and this was at two separate parishes, the way that it was addressed, both of them had to remove all of the paper materials, mostly the Missilex and the other songbooks. And obviously it's very hard to spray paper with Lysol and hope that that book's going to still work out. And that's pretty common sense about why they'd have to do that. But where it kind of left me and kind of left what I feel the rest of the congregation as a whole was not being a true participant in the Mass. Kind of more like, yes, I was there, and yes, I was able to receive the Eucharist for the first time in months, but it didn't feel like I was able to fully, be immersed. Almost as if it was a Mass in a different language, which I've done many different times in my life. And it just felt like something was off and missing. People not being able to sing, be engaged in the sign of peace. Obviously, they changed communion from being what it normally is in the Mass to being after the Mass is over. So it was a lot of changes, and it just felt, obviously it was different, so it felt weird, but it just felt like we weren't able to fully participate. And I have a feeling that I'm not the only one who feels that way. So I wanted to open up this space to have a conversation about that, as I think it's something real, and it scares me that if people get this feeling of it not working for them internally or be able to get over this hump, that it might be a deterrent from returning later down the road. And that obviously is counterproductive to what we're trying to accomplish here. So, Father, I'm hoping you have some thoughts about this and maybe some ways that we as parishioners can wrap our heads around this and become more participatory.
Yeah, it's certainly a very strange time, and part of the challenge is the levels of inconsistency and almost a kind of incoherence, even from one parish to another, from one diocese to another, and even within the same parish. You can't touch the missals, but you can touch the other things, and even the use of masks and sprays. And anyway, it just seems very confusing. The set of principles which any given person is following is very confusing, can be very frustrating, I think. So within that context, how do you receive grace? Well, another thing that occurs to me is a couple of months ago, I can't remember if I actually said it on the podcast. I certainly said it to a number of people. I felt like within the restrictions, there were a lot of ways that we could have found to give communion, to hear confessions, to celebrate the Mass, which would have respected the need for quarantine, separation, preventing contagion, etc. And we didn't do any of that, or very little of that at that time. Now that we're opening things up, we are doing some of those things, and then it seems to have the problems, as you just mentioned. We're asking people not to sing, we're asking people to leave right after communion, we're asking people to do things that we wouldn't normally ask them to do, or in fact, completely contrary to what we would ask them to do in a normal time. And so now that seems very inadequate. And anyway, so it's all a little fuzzy. And I think the main thing is it possible to worship God in this? And is there a purpose to worshiping God? Is there a purpose to receiving Holy Communion? Is there a purpose to doing these things together? Is there a purpose to doing them in church? Is there a meaning to the Mass? And does that persist through all of these adjustments? And is it worth it? What does all of that mean? And I guess that's kind of we have to get back to those more fundamental questions to recognize, well, yes, there is a purpose to all of those things. And if we have to make some sacrifices in order to come together in Mass, if we have to make some sacrifices in order to worship God, if we have to endure some inconsistencies and even seeming irrationality, or somebody's rules that don't seem to entirely make sense, or is it worth it to suffer those things and endure those things for the sake of worshiping God, for the sake of receiving Holy Communion? I think that's the kind of more fundamental question we can come back to. And does that sound right to you?
The core concept makes sense, yes. And I think it's one of these things that's probably easier said than done, because if we all remember what a mass is and what a mass should be, and to have it being so different, it just feels almost as if you have sunburn and then someone hits you on the back. Getting hit on the back is not good in the first place, but then when you have sunburn on top of it, it just adds a little bit to it. And just taking in a side view, you can basically walk into a Walmart now and you can treat it exactly the same as you did before. You don't need to wear a mask. I mean, you can if you want, but you don't need to. You can go through and buy all your stuff. Barring the shortages, it's basically the same store. And life has returned in totality there. So, not to try to scream this is unfair, because somewhere along the way, I believe fairness is like the Easter Bunny and Santa Claus. It's just a lie you tell children to calm them down. But at the end of the day, there's a difference between being fair and being right. The whole rules behind it seem very arbitrary and very inconsistent. And I think that is creating a tension in the loss, being the sunburn and the reference I was making there. So it certainly is important to be involved with the Eucharist. I don't know how many different episodes we've mentioned that in one format or another, and obviously it's nothing I'd like to diminish in that. It's kind of recognition of how important the Eucharist is, and to be almost as a spectator rather than an active participant, and then being given the Eucharist at the end, just it feels wrong. Like wrong may not be in the sense of like you did something evil wrong, but just like not correct way of saying wrong. And that is almost creating an emptiness or a sadness in me. And that's part of, like I said, where I'm hoping that we can get some answers here. And I know that inevitably some sanity will return to the world and we'll be able to go back to how it was. And it's kind of a question of when, not if. But seeing how logic has gone these last couple of months, when can be a long time. And this is probably something that we're going to have to deal with, at least in the Pennsylvania, for a prolonged period of time. I know that if you're in a happier state, that you might be back to normal, if you're in Oklahoma or something like that. But I'm not. And I know that there's a lot of our audience that isn't, and let alone our international audience and how they're dealing with this. So kind of want to deal with that personal feeling of just feeling like I'm watching it rather than being a part of it, if that makes sense, participating in the Mass.
Well, participation, you're participating more physically than you were when you were literally watching it on a screen or on television. And even when we were doing that, the purpose of making a spiritual communion, the purpose of watching it and trying to pray along with everything, had a value to it. There's at some level, the Mass is being offered, and whether we're 10 feet from that offering or 5,000 feet from that offering, the Mass is being offered. And at the same time, our personal participation is not so much about physical proximity. It's about our internal participation, what we're offering in our own lives, and really bringing our own lives before the Lord and making that offering to Him. I think it's that's fundamentally what's happening in our worship. Is we're saying that God is worthy. Worthship is where that comes from. God is worthy of everything in my life. God is worthy of everything I can offer Him. And so I offer that to Him. Now, how do I do that concretely? Well, I make the intention inside of myself, but I need some concrete actions to go through to make an offering to Him. Well, He helped us to do that by taking on flesh, becoming one of us, and making that offering in our midst. And in a mysterious and a mystical way, He takes all of our offerings onto His one offering, and He makes that offering on the cross when Jesus offers His total self-sacrifice. And He offers everything to the Father. And He says to the Father, you are worthy of everything, of all that I am and all that I have. And when Jesus does that, He does that with all of us and for all of us. But we have to do it also for ourselves. And so we make that total offering of showing His worthiness by giving everything. So we can do that from our living room. We can do that from a park. We can do that from a lot of places. But we do that in a more perfect way, in a more perfected way, when we do that in Christ and with Christ. And in particular, with His whole church in the rights that He has given us to do that. So He's made it possible through the Eucharist given to us at the Last Supper, given to the apostles to make this offering. It's like a highway. I suppose you can get from point A to point B by walking through the forest, through the jungle, and you'll get there eventually. But if you align your movement, your direction with the highway, then you move a lot more effectively, a lot more fully. And the Eucharist is, it's more than a highway. But anyway, just to extend the analogy, it's a way of offering of uniting ourselves with Him, uniting our offering with Him, that it arrives at its destination more perfectly, more fully, more quickly, more beautifully. And so we're doing all of that. Now, that actually has nothing to do with the reception of Holy Communion, and the precept of the Church is to participate in the Mass, not to receive Holy Communion. We're required to receive Holy Communion once a year, but we're required every week to participate in the Mass. And that participation, so learning how to participate in the Mass without even receiving Holy Communion, is a good thing for each of us to keep growing in and finding ways to do that. And then Holy Communion is not just a bonus. It's much more than a bonus. It's certainly receiving from the fruitfulness of the Mass is a beautiful and integral and an important part of the Mass. But it's, the Mass has meaning and value even without the reception of Holy Communion.
Sure. And yeah, I'm certainly not trying to diminish that at all. And I don't want this to come across that way. And I mean, obviously, there's a reason that the Mass is pivotal. That actually just made me think of another question, which you're at the Mass. I just don't understand why you would, if you're already at a Mass, why you wouldn't receive communion. Are there rules in the church around that, or because? I know that, you have an obligation to go to Mass every week. That's part of the faith. But then you just said you only need to receive communion once a year. So that didn't add up to me. Could you clarify that real quick?
Yeah, well, are you worthy at every Mass? Are you adequately prepared? Have you participated sufficiently? Are you in a state of grace to receive Holy Communion? And the church has had a little bit of a development in approach over the centuries, and it's gone a bit in waves from what I understand. It's not a linear development, but recognizing that communion is God. And, there are plenty of examples in the Old Testament where people touch the tabernacle and die, for example. I mean, touching God, receiving God, having contact with God, the whole people of Israel, as they saw the cloud and the fire and the lightning and the thunder on the mountain, said to Moses, like, we don't really feel like we need to go up there and be part of all this. Why don't you just go ahead and do it? And then you come back down and you tell us like what's going on with that. I mean, there is a sense of an awesome fear before the Almighty God, which makes one say, maybe I don't need to receive communion every week. I'm going to come here to the base of the mountain and let all of that happen. And the priest is doing all of that in the sanctuary, and that's all good. And I'm going to offer my participation from a distance and receive from a distance. And so there's something that's legitimate about that. And just presuming that everybody is kind of in a place that they recognize what they're doing and are ready to do that, well, there's some room there. Now, there's another side of that, which has kind of captured the more modern heart and mind, which is that communion is really a medicine for sinners, that it's not the prize of the perfect, that it's not something that you need to be in your absolute best frame of mind or frame of soul or whatever to receive, but in fact, receiving that, the Eucharist is going to help you become more fully who you were made to be. And so we kind of recognize, well, no, I'm not worthy to receive God, and I'm not really ready to receive God, but I'm going to trust in his mercy and receive him anyway, and let the power of that grace transform me from within to become more worthy and to become more ready. And that's kind of the approach that St. Pius X took in the beginning of the 20th century when he lowered the age of First Holy Communion, and he really promoted frequent reception of Holy Communion. And that didn't fully take hold until really after the Second Vatican Council, when the process of frequent communion became so prominent that everybody, every time you go to Mass, just like you expressed, Joe, that everybody had a sense like, yeah, I need Jesus, and I'm here. Now, the caveat with that is, of course, that if you're not in a state of grace, having committed a mortal sin, if there's a rupture in your relationship with God that's significant enough, then receiving communion would make it worse. And so we refrain from Holy Communion until we can go to the sacrament of confession and be reconciled with God. And then the kind of blending together of those things is that, and you'll still find this in a more traditional parish, people will only go to communion when they can go to confession immediately before. So basically before Mass, or even during the beginning of Mass, and this would be more common in the older rite of Mass, the extraordinary form of the Mass, that people will go to communion or go to confession during the liturgy of the Word, and even during the liturgy of the Eucharist. So they're praying, they're participating in their own way. They're not trying to follow along all of the texts, which are in Latin anyway, but they're really praying the Mass while standing in line to go to confession. And then they confess their sins, they receive absolution, and then they're ready to receive Holy Communion. And they're not doing that every week necessarily. And they're only receiving communion after they go to confession to be sort of at their best. Anyway, these are different approaches to the question, and I'm not sort of weighing in on what's better or worse. Each of them has problems and each of them has benefits, and so, but that's kind of the context of that whole question.
And that leads to another thought and another question. I don't want to get too far away from the original topic of today's episode, but as you mentioned in there, part of the Pope's job is to look to see where we're at as a people in this place and time, and to guide us to become closer to God. I mean, that's inevitably the Pope's job, or at least part of it. And it made me think of this because we've spoken many times before that the miracle of the resurrection is a moment that happens outside of space-time. That's something that we all actively participate at each Mass, essentially. And we recognize that we are different than people who are at this Revolutionary War period or any other time before then. Like, people are different, and the most easy way to recognize that is transportation. or technology. It's probably more specific on that, in that, you used to take months to get across from the East Coast to the West Coast. Now you can take a couple of hours on a plane, and that the world has changed, but human nature, in a certain sense, is more or less the same. We still have the similar thoughts and feelings and all these things for all time. And where I'm trying to get with that is right and wrong is wrong, and sin is sin, and grace is grace. That doesn't change. So, in a sense, Christ is a moment outside of time at the resurrection, and in theory, the judgment is too. I might be a little bit off on that, but if it's at the end of the time, at the end of the days for everyone, it's the same end of day as the last day, regardless of when you had your time on earth. So this is kind of a long lead up, but are we judged based upon an absolute of what we should be as a human person, or relative to the times in which we are in? And like I said, I know that's a little bit different than the conversation we're having about the Mass, but in a sense, our Mass is different because of the times that we're in. So, does that make sense? The question I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, well, first of all, there are two judgments. There's a particular judgment for each of us individually, and then there's a final judgment, a kind of universal judgment. So that's part of your question. But yeah, our particular judgment is based on it's always relative to our level of knowledge and our level of freedom. So we're not held responsible for things we don't know. Now, if we're negligent, if the reason we don't know them is because we refuse to learn them, that's a different story. But the things that we know, which we pick up a lot of that from culture. We pick that up from people around us, and in addition to our active efforts to read and study and listen to podcasts and these kinds of things. So there's a level of knowledge, and then there's also a level of freedom. This is a little bit, maybe you can indulge a quick story that I always find interestingly edifying. There's Totally Secular. He's actually kind of anti-Catholic, but he's an anthropologist. I'm sure I've mentioned this on a previous podcast, but it's worth repeating. He did research with some chimpanzees, and he had a male chimpanzee and 6 females. And then he naturally copulated with 3 of the females who were sort of his match, probably. I mean, there's something biological going on there. And then they put those 3 on birth control pills, which have the effect at a pheromone level. The body, it's really telling the body that the female is pregnant. So that's the effect of it. And then he picked up on that, and he didn't copulate with them. He copulated with the other 3. And then when they put all 6 of them on birth control pills, he went into a depression. He began to masturbate. He started to get very upset and was deeply affected by that. And so in a time when so much of our female population is taking birth control pills, what kind of impact is that having on the men in society? And we're totally unaware of, because this is all happening at the level of pheromones, which 80% of us pick up on. There are about 20% of people that are not really tuned into pheromones. They're also scent-based, so it's a place in our olfactory nerve that picks up on pheromones. But the point is, there are these unintended consequences. There are these broad effects in society that we don't even know how much that's affecting our freedom. So it might be 1,000 times harder to live chastity in our own time because of this reason. But we don't really have a way of knowing that or measuring that. And so is God judging us based on the context in which we're living? Well, yes, absolutely, because he's judging us relative to our level of knowledge and our level of freedom. To say it another way, when people 1,000 years ago were not praying for the Native Americans because they didn't know they existed. They weren't guilty for that. How could they be culpable for not doing something that they had no access to actually knowing about or doing? But we in our global society are have every reason to be aware of the kinds of injustices that are happening and to the kinds of needs of prayer and the proclamation of the gospel. And we have much more global outreach and global capacity for knowledge. So for us to be ignorant of those things and then to do nothing about them is going to be a different level of culpability than for somebody 1,000 years ago. So yeah, certainly the opportunities, the challenges that we have in our time matter.
And that makes sense. And there's a lot of logic in that. And so on that note, if unless I'm putting something in your mouth that's not there, having a sense that the mass is different and recognizing that doesn't make you go into a state of sin or negative effect. It's just you being a person living in the times you are and having a reaction to something that you can't control. In the fact that we don't have the freedom of doing that. I mean, realistically, unless you're in the government and pretty much as the governor, you don't have control over this at that point. So, with that being said, Father, if you have any last final thoughts before we conclude today's episode, where we're starting to go a little bit long on it, I just want to give you a chance to conclude it here.
Yeah. Well, I think you made a great summary there. I mean, we have to live this time as best we can. And there are a lot of challenges. And, you mentioned the sunburn, getting slapped on the back with a sunburn. And it really does feel that way. There's a lot of frustrations, a lot of incoherence, a lot of irrationality, a lot of fears, a lot of weird things are happening. But it's outside of our control. So we can either do our best within these constructs or we can be frustrated and separate ourselves from them, but it's not clear that that's more fruitful. So do your best within the kind of weird constructions that we're in, and insofar as we have influence or insofar as we can move things forward, great. And otherwise, we just try to worship God as best we can within the limitations of the current day.
Well, I thank you for those final words. And yeah, and to anyone who's out there who knows someone who's feeling these types of ways, if you could just click the button inside your iTunes to send it to them, we'd like to try to help people, as many people as we can. And that's one of the ways also we can grow the thing. But just send it over to them, and it'll just arrive to them as a text message in very non-threatening kind of way. So again, we thank everyone for listening, and we'll be with you again here next week.